Did everyone receive that notification?
Yep.
Great. Have a good meeting.
Thank you. Chairman Lawrence, would you like to call the meeting to order?
Yes, thank you, Yvonne. Welcome, everyone. I'm calling this meeting to order. I know we have an extensive agenda today to get through. So can we just take the attendance by who's on the screen, or do you and defer with calling it out?
I think we can do that.
Okay.
Everybody's got a name, and I think we're good. A quick introduction of Quetzi Lozado. Did I pronounce that right? Ketsi, who is our newest member. Welcome aboard. This crew is not shy and they're chatters. So during the course of the conversation, I think you'll get a good feel for who you're working with. So we do have an extensive agenda, and some of it we'll be able to do in a few minutes. Some of it's going to take some longer conversations. So I will resist my compulsion to babble, and we'll generally try to get this moving along briskly. Gene has told us he has to leave around noon. Obviously, as people need to come and go, that's fine. Just let us know. And so very quickly, to summarize how we got here, when we first organized the group, we did a survey of priorities. We then broke into 5 what we called work groups to do research on specific issues related to some of the priority issues, so that we would get to this point where we would provide background information on the issues, pros and cons, to different approaches to address the issues, so that this group, as we gathered as a whole, could go through the list of issues with very little background from us, with the expectation that what we sent you 2 weeks ago really filled in the information that you would need, that this would be a matter of looking at issues and deciding if some of the potential solutions out there were appropriate recommendations for us to make to the General Assembly in our June report this year. So we had a couple, 3 guiding principles as we were looking at all of these things. One is that this is a very diverse state. Different counties have very different needs based on geography, population, and a whole bunch of other issues, that any proposals that we make have to be conscious of the fact that they will cost money to implement in many cases, and that unfunded mandates are generally not happy events. And the third, and I think most significant for the counties, or maybe right up there with the money, is giving sufficient lead-in time. If we're going to propose changes to procedure, counties need enough time to be responsive, to get their ducks in a row, so that they're not scrambling at the last minute, and the last minute frequently can be 3-4 months before an election, trying to implement a new procedure. So with that as the background, I think we're going to start with the issues we outlined. And the first of that is voter registration. We talked about the SURE system and some of the concerns that have been raised in the past over it. I think generally what we came up with, and Jonathan Marks, thank you for giving us some really good information on how the SURE modernization project is unfolding. That the sense was that rather than try to propose yet new changes to the SURE system, it would be more appropriate to watch and wait to see what is happening with the modernization project, and the expectation that probably by next spring, most of it would be implemented. Jonathan, have I said anything not true with that?
Nope, you got it right, Yvonne.
So I think generally, if we could just get a consensus that we're going to wait and see about SURE before we make any specific recommendations on ways to change that, other than some other aspects that we've talked about. We're actually going to talk about next, which is the ERIC system. Generally, everybody okay with that approach? I see lots of nodding heads. Okay, and a couple of thumbs up. Great, great.
Yvonne, this is Joe. Just real
Yeah.
quick, there was a lot of discussion about the implementation of the new shore system at our County Commissioners Association meeting this past weekend. So I do think that we should wait and see, but I also think that we should keep a very, very close eye on the implementation phases. I know a lot of elections directors through their commissioners were sharing a great deal of concern. Obviously, it's new and it's going to be a lot of change and a lot of reluctance, but I do think we need to keep a very close eye on the implementation.
Oh, yeah, no, I think ultimately the responsibility of this body is, once that implementation has been achieved, to sit down, talk to the commissioners and the directors and see if it's working for them. And if there are other things that we hear that we think could improve what has been accomplished with the modernization project, then I think that's this board's role to come back and look at it and say, hey, that was great, but it wasn't enough. This is some changes you need to make in addition to that. So yeah, no, I think we're going to be following this pretty closely, and I'll be pestering Jonathan a lot. So
Hello, Vaughn. This is
Yes,
Gene
Gene.
DiGirolamo.
yes.
Yeah. Can I just jump in? Joe mentioned something. I wasn't able to be up at the CCAP conference, but am I right to understand that the delegation of Republican county commissioners had voted, or they did vote it down, this new SURE system, or what happened actually in the Republican conference, county commissioners, when it came to the SURE system?
Yeah, Gene, there was some discussion. They obviously showed through a vote that they were not thrilled about the implementation of the new system. I think a lot of that stems from what they're hearing from their elections directors. Obviously, they are the boots on the ground, and not to get too far into the weeds, but I think that there's just a lot of nervousness about the new system. And I think even Jonathan's heard a lot of that, I'm sure. It's anytime there's a new system, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty.
Okay. Were you there, Jonathan, at that meeting, and the secretary?
I was not at the meeting you're referring to. I think that was a separate meeting, but Veronica DeGraffenreid from the governor's office and I were at a meeting. I think one of the breakout sessions on shore modernization with county commissioners. It was well attended. It was good to see you there, Commissioner Vogler. I don't see you for months, and then I see you twice in 1 week. But a lot of the concerns we've actually heard are about sort of the system security and how it's going to differ from the current system. And we are working with our Office of Administration to put together information based on the feedback we got the other day from county commissioners. I do want to make one point so it doesn't get lost. We implemented phase 1 last week, and that's why you're hearing a lot. Those of you who are county commissioners are hearing a lot from your election directors right now. But phase 1 is being done in parallel. That's sort of a conscious plan. We still have shore, the current shore system. We're running this year's election on the current shore system, but we're running the other system in parallel to work through these issues before we actually go live. Historically, the project management methodology has been to do a whole lot of development, documentation, all of that, do some testing, and then launch the system, and it's live and everyone's using it. We're doing it differently this time. We're doing it in parallel so we can fix fix whatever bugs there are, if there are any, and address any concerns before this thing is actually live to the world.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay. The next item we talked about with voter registration is the voter list maintenance and the participation of Pennsylvania in the Electronic Registration Information Center. Currently, Pennsylvania's participation is voluntary. We have been part of it for several years, but it is subject to administration change and any given administration deciding whether or not we should participate in that. It is not uniform participation across the country. Between 20 and 30 states are members. Louisiana left the group in January, citing that they didn't feel they were getting their money's worth, I believe. And a special counsel report coming out of Wisconsin on their election systems also felt that they should withdraw from the ERIC system. So it's not, the world of states, it's not 100% participation, but our state auditor general in auditing our voter maintenance list has actually criticized the fact that we did not use ERIC as extensively as our membership would have allowed. So the question, I think, is, do we make our participation in ERIC statutorily mandated participation, or do we leave it at voluntary status? And that then comes into play with the next issue, which is updating voter registration lists related to deceased voters. So I think they should be dealt with separately. And I think the first is, should our participation in ERIC be statutorily mandated, and in which it will expand across administrations, and one administration can pick or choose whether or not they're going to be in it. Russ, did I see your hand go up?
Yes, you did, Yvonne. I just a general commentary. When you do something statutorily, if you want to undo it, it requires another statute. So we just have to keep that in mind. The way technology works today is that what's really cool and happening right now may not be tomorrow. So I'm not sure that statutorily is the best idea when you're talking about implementing like technological connections. On the other hand, I don't want each administration to have free reign and say, we're in, we're out, we're in, we're out. We need some sort of continuity, administration to administration. So maybe any statutory language that is provided only provides for participation in something rather than specifically the ERIC system, because we did see recently that the states of Wisconsin and Louisiana have pulled out of ERIC for various reasons. So I wouldn't want to statutorily say we're participating in ERIC, but if we could statutorily say we're participating in some multi-state kind of system that allows us to do what ERIC does, I think that would be a better idea. We wouldn't want to tie the hands of the General Assembly and make them go back and undo it if ERIC just disbands. So
some states, okay, Jonathan, I'll just throw this in real quick and then Jonathan is up. Several states that we looked at did essentially that. They mandated ERIC or a comparable database. And I think one or two actually said at least one plus others. So that's not unheard of at all. Jonathan.
Yes, thank you, Yvonne. I just wanted to, respond to Representative Diamond, clarify a couple of things. One, I don't believe Louisiana has actually pulled out. They've suspended their participation in ERIC And nor do I believe Wisconsin has made a decision. That's the recommendation, I guess, on in a report that was submitted to the legislature there. But I agree with Representative Diamond on, if we put ERIC into the statute, then if some successor organization comes along, it's a lot harder to participate in that successor organization. Right now, Pennsylvania law, as well as federal law on voter registration, requires states and our state law requires local jurisdictions to conduct reasonable efforts to maintain their voter rolls, so long as they're uniform and non-discriminatory. And we've utilized ERIC now, as you said, Yvonne, for the past several years. We're happy with the experience. I think the counties are mostly happy with the experience as well, and we're getting data that we weren't getting before. In addition to the things that are statutorily required, like the national change of address program that counties have to do annually, but we're getting potential duplicate data that we wouldn't otherwise get, or we would have to go to some other resource and do our own data analysis. So we're a proud member of ERIC, and right now that's 30 states. Even if you subtract Louisiana and Wisconsin, you're still almost at 30 states plus the District of Columbia.
Okay, then Randall, I'm sorry.
Prior to ERIC, Pennsylvania was a member of the Interstate Crosscheck. I would be personally not a fan of mandating membership in a particular organization. I do think that there's benefit to sharing information with other states. I think the ideal would be a situation that 50 states are members of, as opposed to 20 and 30. But ERIC is not a 50-state member, does not have 50-state membership. And I guess my thoughts were, mandating ERIC is probably a bit short-sighted. That may be the best product now, but that doesn't mean that'll be the best product in 5, 7, or 10 years. So, but I think it's important that we, utilize the data we can exchange with other states. But mandating a particular source of that data, I would not be in favor of.
Okay, well then I guess what I think I think what I'm hearing is support for a mandate to participate in interstate databases, but just not any specific one in itself. So I guess then my question is, would you collectively authorize us to draft legislation? And obviously we would be bringing that back to our May meeting for review and approval and to look at the actual language, but for us to draft an amendment that would mandate use of national databases to help update voter lists. So do I hear a consensus on that, or see as I'm looking at the screen? Everybody cool with that?
You can put your physical hand up.
Okay,
So
yeah.
you get a vote that way. That way we have it recorded.
Well,
I
I had a question. Yeah, I thought it's a Jonathan and maybe both I have questions.
Okay.
John, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Patrick. I generally agree with that, and I'm going to vote in favor of that. I just want to make sure I understand the motion here. It's to draft language and seek input then from the members. I think we have to be careful. We want to put language in there. Obviously, whatever program we use has to be uniform and non-discriminatory. It's going to have to comply with federal law, with state law. And we also want to make sure that it's a good product. The one advantage of ERIC versus Randall mentioned interstate crosscheck. Interstate crosscheck was limited because it was only using voter registration data. ERIC utilizes other sources of data, including the Social Security Administration. They have agreements with them, non-disclosure agreements, so that we know we're getting good data and that there's good data matching criteria. Interstate crosscheck was limited because it was states providing only their voter registration data set. And that comparison was being done purely with voter registration data, and there were no other data inputs there. And the data, and Randall can attest to this, the data was, was obviously, erroneous in more cases than it wasn't. And it added a lot of work to the department and as well as county election office.
Yeah, just to clarify, with any of these items that we discussed that result in a decision to draft statutory language, we would take the first cut at it. We would get input, and a decision would not be made on the final language until this board met as a group again in May. And even then, and obviously we would send it out prior to the meeting, but with the expectation if there were concerns about the language that we would be able to iron them out at that meeting, so that that meeting would be the one where the language was actually formally approved. So what we're asking with all of these is basically a directive to go ahead and draft language that hopefully, we've talked about this enough within the work groups and with this group that we can come pretty close to what the language should say, and then as a group work out any fine details that need to be done. Pat, you wanted to say something?
No, between Jonathan's question and your response, I think I'm all set for now.
Cool. Okay, good. Anybody else? Okay, so the next one is to talk about.
Did we get a vote on that?
Yeah, we did.
Okay.
Give you an exact number, but I don't like to count exact numbers. It was a majority. We don't do, honestly, I mean, Russ is laughing at me, but our goal is consensus. Our goal isn't to say, 8 to 7, it passed, everybody, because everybody's, you can go out after the report is released and you can have a press conference. You can say, yeah, they all agreed to that, but I don't like that. And that's fine. But at the time the report's coming out, it's the consensus of the board overall. So those little, those niceties of close shave votes are something we try to avoid. Like, I was going to say the plague, but maybe I should say COVID, So anyway, so as long as I see what looks like more than a tiny majority, we're not going to count votes. And if we do end up with a proposal where it is really close, and we decide to move forward with a proposal, in those instances, we always put in the report what the objections were, what the minority view was, and why those objections were made. So our goal always is full disclosure and consensus. So anyway, moving on, deceased voters. Now, I believe we've heard from everybody that that's a problem of getting deceased voters off the rolls. And part of the problem is that right now our statute limits what the counties can use to report deceased voters, and that the process is very narrow. And so one of the things that we had heard proposed was to amend that section of the election code to authorize the use of national databases specifically to verify deaths of voters, because right now Pennsylvania does not have the ability to look at anything outside of that limited list within the statute for that. So Anybody want to talk about that a little bit? Oh, Randall, you know what? Everybody else's hand is yellow and yours is very pale. It throws me off. Anyway.
Sorry. As Jonathan can attest, I was an absolute thorn in the Department of State's side when they wanted to use the Social Security death information from Eric in order to have counties cancel voter records, because my belief was that that was not lawful. I fully support making that lawful, that counties should have that tool in order to, although I would probably limit it, your words of using national database records, I would probably narrow it down to Social Security Administration records, and whoever the source of that is, if it comes through a national database, fine. But using Social Security records, which are pretty accurate as to voters being alive or dead, I would be in favor of adding that to the sources that registrars can currently legally use to cancel a voter for being deceased. The least useful on that one is the letters of testamentary from the Register of Wills office, which Lancaster did use, but that's generally only filed for one of the two members of the couple, whoever the last living member is. And obituaries at this point have become a paid advertisement, at least in my market. And so there's many voters not paying to several $100s to run an obituary. But I would be fully in favor of adding Social Security records, but I would limit the language, to Social Security records. I don't think we want to start using other sources of deceased voter info from national databases.
Okay. Jonathan?
Yes, I agree. First, Randall, I would not call you a thorn in the department's side. All feedback is good feedback, no matter how it's delivered, as long as it's constructive feedback. No, I agree. It should be limited in some way, whether it's, I guess, Social Security. I can't think of another official source of information beside, the Department of Health in Pennsylvania, which is already in statute, and what Randall was talking about from the Register of Wills, letters testamentary. So I'm okay limiting it to, official, data from the Social Security Administration.
Okay. Jim?
Thanks, Yvonne. So we practice estate administration law here at the firm, and I'll bet, unless you have more than $7,000 worth of assets, there's really no reason to open up an estate. So everybody who doesn't have that much in personal assets, there won't be opening up an estate, and you won't get letters of administration or letters testamentary. So that's not really a good, reliable source of death information for what it's worth.
No, I think I know, at least from my experience in this area as well, obituaries are not as good a source as they were, say, 20 years ago, because of just that. People have to pay hundreds of dollars to have them listed, and so they're not doing it. So I think what I'm hearing is everybody agrees that the sources currently in place are not sufficient to do the job. And so I guess I'm going to make the question that should we propose an amendment to that section relating to deceased voters that would allow the Department of State to use Social Security Administration records to update voter lists. Jim.
That's a thumbs up, not a hand raise. So
okay,
I'm voting
cool.
yes in favor of that.
Okay. Okay, so then I'm going to ask Pat, are you agreeing or are you talking?
Just one
I guess, point of clarification. So with that language, it would be specific enough so that the deceased voter list information from Eric would be usable. But what about the NAPSIS database and source that was also named in the working group report? I
think we're going to have to play with that language, Pat, and bring it back to you once we go back and actually start looking, see who's using those Social Security records, and then be able to write it in such a way that it would encompass Social Security records through those other databases as well. But the basis of the information would be SSA, however that information got to you. I think that's what we're looking at.
Okay.
You okay with that? Okay. So how about a show of hands and tell me what you think.
Physically raise your hand. There's your majority.
Yes, there is. Sounds good. Thank you, people. Okay, the next couple we talked about in the work groups. I think generally the consensus there was that these were not things people would necessarily, not things everybody would support. I think it was a mixed opinion on the value of, so we did talk, so I'm just going to open up a little bit to discuss, to see that it really is consensus of the entire board that these are not areas we want to prepare recommendations in. And the first is automatic voter registration. There are some states, jurisdictions where, say, getting your driver's license automatically registers you as a voter. And part of the conversation around that issue was a debate between what is the responsibility of the voter who wants to register to vote, how much should the government insist that you vote, that you be forced to register, when there are people who don't want to be in databases, for whatever reasons don't want to be registered to vote. Although as a general rule, we may think that everybody should vote and everybody should be registered to vote. The question becomes, is that the role of government to put them on the rolls automatically? So guess I'd open it up to kind of, what do y'all think? This is something we should consider doing. Russ?
I think that even if this board would be in favor of moving towards that with the implementation of the new SURE system, I would rather see we do right what we're doing now with the new system before we even entertain a conversation about this sort of change. That's all.
Jonathan?
No, that's a fair point. I think we discussed this in our breakout sessions on this work group. If you do something like automatic voter registration or even the next item, same day voter registration, you have to make sure that you have the infrastructure in place to make that work. And so it would require a significant investment in infrastructure to make it work. Automatic voter registration would require changes at the Department of Transportation. Same day registration, may require electronic poll books at polling places, depending on what the model looks like. And those are significant investments. I think it's good policy to get people registered to vote in every way you can. But it would come with a price tag and an investment in infrastructure, and that would take time to ramp up as well.
Dan?
Thank you, Yvonne, and good morning, everybody. I recall our committee or our work group having a conversation about this issue, and in preparing for today's meeting, look back on it and gave it a good deal of thought. I'm 62 years old. I've never missed an election, and I bet just about everybody on this group has probably voted with great regularity throughout their lives. And as Mr. Marks said, the goal is to have as many people vote who wish to vote. But I think as well, we need to be respectful of the fact that we would live in a country where if a person, for whatever reason, does not desire to be registered or does not desire to participate in the electoral process, as much as we may not agree with that point of view, I think we need to be respectful of it. So for that reason, I would have some reluctance for, and this may not be the appropriate word, but forced voter registration. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but again, it's very philosophical in terms of how I look at it. But my recollection is from the discussion of the work group, I think most of the other folks on that group felt the same way. Thank you.
Well, like I said, some of these issues we're going to get through relatively quickly, but in fairness to the whole board, I wanted to make sure we made everybody aware that we had at least looked at all the issues that had been assigned to the work groups. So I'm going to, actually, I think Jonathan provided a lovely segue into the same day voter registration issue, and kind of the same concerns were raised about being able to accomplish that with our current precinct-based voting systems, where not everybody has electronic polling books, and let's throw in our broadband too, not everybody has connectivity. And so I think we can put those two together as a no, but I think Pat wants to say something.
Thanks, Yvonne. It was actually just to corroborate the initial point that Representative Diamond made, and that I agree with for these 2 points. I mean, the same day voter registration, I think, is arguably the most valuable of the three here that are kind of next to each other: automatic, same day, and then pre-registration. But I just wanted to kind of agree with that point. As much as I would certainly want to come back to same day, I don't think this year with this board is where we're going to get to it, and so we can hold it perhaps for next year, and probably the same for pre-registration. If I can help us move us through the agenda.
Yeah, and that's the thing we have to remember. This is a permanent board. Anything we do today can't be done or undone 5 years down the road if the infrastructure is not in place right now to allow same day voter registration. There may come a time in the future where the technology and the infrastructure is in place and it's something we want to reconsider. So that's something to think about, kind of in the back of your minds as we're working on this stuff. This is not, the June report is not the be all and end all that we, and I guess this is something I wanted to bring up too, and that's going to come up here very soon in the agenda. A lot of what we did in the work groups and a lot of what we talked about were what have been considered urgent matters that need to be addressed in the election law sooner rather than later. But also part of our directive is to clean up the 37 code, and cleaning that up is going to be a very long haul process of reconciling language, making it modern language. So that's, there are a couple instances where we're going to get into that aspect of our directive, but most of our focus right now has been on more immediate concerns, but we have a lot of long-term concerns that we need to get into over time, and we'll continue to look at down the road. And Lisa, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just basically going to say what Pat said. So in light of the time constraint, I just figured, no worries.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, hopefully, I don't know. Again, have to think about some in-person meetings because Zoom meetings are kind of limited by time. If I can drag you all into Harrisburg for a day, I can whip you through a lot of stuff if I get 5 or 6 hours crack at you. But with these 2-hour things, I try not to rush, but at the same time, we're going to try to get things accomplished. Having said that, the next issue that we put in was pre-registration. And Pennsylvania has a form of pre-registration now for kids who are going to turn, and I say kids because I think anyone under about 30 is a kid. So, but kids who are going to turn 18 before the election, but are not going to be 18 in time to register to vote for that election. We do have a process where they can pre-register in anticipation of their 18th birthday. So we do have a limited period where that we do make sure if you're going to be 18 years old on election day and you want to vote, you can get registered and you can vote. The pre-registration things that we've seen in other states and that we've talked about have been more along the lines of being 16, and when you get your driver's license, you can pre-register to vote, that kind of thing. And there are a couple of states that do that. Technologically, I don't believe it's so much of an issue in Pennsylvania as is the practical aspects of it that we discussed in the work groups quite a bit. And that is, if you register to vote at the age of 16, you don't know where you're going to be living when you're 18. You could be on a college campus, you could be in the military, you could be who knows where, doing your gap year in Nepal, whatever. But if you register at 16, are you going to remember to update your address at 18? Where are you going to do your registration? That there were a lot of logistical concerns in with that. And so again, I think it's one that Pennsylvania has addressed in the short term, where it's a more pressing issue. In the long term, really didn't have a lot of consensus on whether or not this is a good or a bad idea. So again, this is one I think we want to say we can think about down the road, but we don't really think we should be doing it right now. Anybody? Randall. You have to unmute. There he is.
Change my hand color for you, Milan. It's pre-registration for the legit. Our goal, speaking as a former election director, the goal should be to maintain as clean of a voter record as absolutely possible. And letting kids register when they're 16 years old who don't know where they're going to be living when they turn 18 or even vote does not go towards that goal. More just a step beyond that. I think you had implied in your introduction that you can register to vote when the voter registration deadline would preclude you from registering as long as you're going to be 18. It's actually broader than that. You can register to vote anytime once you will be 18 years of age before the next election. My son will be 18 in April. He registered in December for the upcoming May primary at 17 years old. That can, most 17-year-olds don't do that, but you can do that, and it's not just if your birthday's in that window. As long as you're going to be 18 years of age before the next election, you can submit a voter registration application. But I think my experience, my prior time as the election directors, I think they're almost all those I had heard from during that time were not in favor of allowing pre-registration because of the detrimental effect it would have to having accurate voter records, not having people on more than one record. The kid votes when they're registers to vote at 16 when they get their driver's license or apply for the permit. They go off to college, they register to vote there. Now you got duplicate registrations. It just really logistically complicates things to allow someone to do it 2 years ahead when you have a time of that much change happening in life without any way to really anticipate it.
Ken?
Randall, I think your hand color was fine just the way it was. So I do want to say that first, but and I agree with everything that Randall said as well. And I've talked to our election folks about that, and they just feel to have that data there for 2 years and not knowing what was going to happen once the person actually turns 18, that there's just not much value in that and could cause a lot of confusion down the road.
Thanks, Ken. And your hand color is fine too. Anyway, okay, so I think we're in agreement that that's another nope. So the next issue is one of those that leans more into that long-term clean up the election code assignment that we have. And so this is not proposing changing the law at all. This is a proposal to clean up the statute. The statute regarding voter registration by formerly incarcerated persons was found partially unconstitutional in a case called Mixon. And the Department of State on their website and in practice applies the Mixon rules to the statute because that's how you read the law. You read the statute and then you read the court interpretations. But it's also really sloppy from a legislative drafting position. And it requires a person looking at it, if they're not looking at the Department of State website, to find the statute, find the annotations to the statute and read the cases. And so what we're proposing, and from this perspective, I can clearly claim this is a legislative attorney recommendation, is that all the law should be in one place. And so what we would like to do is amend those provisions regarding formerly incarcerated persons to codify the constitutional opinion found in Mixon. It's a cleanup. We would not be changing anything. We would make that clear in the report that that was in fact what we were doing. So again, at this point, I would just like you all to say, yeah, go ahead and do that. We're cleaning house. I saw Jim and then I saw Christina and Randall and Jonathan.
I just wanted to echo support for your desire to clean up the statute, Yvonne. That's always a good idea. And if the case law underlying the change is good and well reasoned, then we should clean up the statute. So I'm in favor of that. Thanks.
Christina.
Agree completely, 100%.
Cool. Randall. Cool. Jonathan. Yay. Okay. Everybody on board? Wave your hands. Yay. Okay, good. The next two issues are more kind of advisory on where we're going with voter registration. Again, we have one of these situations between the 1936, because all of you know, the general public may not be completely aware. We have a statute, and it's because of the way laws are written in Pennsylvania. We have a statute from 1937 called the Election Code, and that has been the election law for a very long time. But we also have the consolidated statutes, and there is a Title 25 called Election Code, which was amended in the 1990s, I believe, when the SURE system was set up and the voter registration rules were set up. So we have two statutes called the Election Code, one unconsolidated, one codified, and they have some provisions that are not identical and that should be reconciled. And again, near and dear to my heart as a legislative attorney is they should be reconciled. So One of the areas where the language is a little different is the language of determining residency in the 37 code versus Title 25. So what we'd like to do is take those two statutes, reconcile them, and put them into one section of the consolidated statutes. And obviously, you know, we'd be running it by you guys, making sure that we, you know, reconciled in the right direction and we weren't picking possibly conflicting residency requirements. And part of it would be checking with you all to verify how this actually is accomplished in practice. Because again, you've got lengthy language in this 37 code about determining residency, but you also have language in Title 25 regarding determined residency. Now, this is one where I'm not 100% sure we can accomplish this before the June report comes out, but this is a project we would like to work on moving forward. If we can get it in the June report, great. If not, we'll move it into next year's report, but it's a cleanup job that we feel needs to be done. Any thoughts? Everybody want to wave and say, go at it, have fun? Yay. Okay, cool beans. And then the other one, and assisted registration, we've talked about this a fair amount in some of the work groups, and not that we've come to any reconciliation, but there are concerns that have been raised about how assisted voting occurs. And so right now, where did he get to, Grant? Grant is doing some research right now on assisted voting and what the rules are and what the case law is and how that all applies. And that is definitely going to be a next fall work group kind of discussion, because it is lengthy, and we're talking about not only people who come into the polling place to have someone assist them to vote, but also in the nursing homes, in extended care facilities, on how voters are registering to vote, how they're obtaining ballots, those kind of issues. So we want to do a deeper dive into that from our end to bring it back to you all. But so in this issue, I'm just kind of reporting, we're looking at it, we've talked about it in a couple of the work groups. And so we want to be able to provide you with as much background information as we can to help make some decisions about how this is gonna, how or why, or if we should change things. There was just something in the news a couple of days ago about Wisconsin, and it comes back to the mail-in ballots and how they have a new statute that prohibits anybody from returning a ballot for anybody for any reason. If you, whatever your disability, if you're doing an absentee ballot, you personally must mail it. If that you can't have even hand it to somebody to mail for you, and their Supreme Court got involved in it, and we don't have that restriction now, so it's not such an issue, and it is something that we want to talk about when we get to the absentee and mail-in ballots. But the broader issue of assisting voters overlaps a number of the work groups. And so we're gonna look a lot more intensely at that. Jonathan.
Yes, thank you, Yvonne. I wanted to take the opportunity to point out there is a mechanism in the election code right now for basically having an election board at a nursing facility The problem, just as we've discussed on numerous other issues, is the law is outdated, uses old language. It limits it to facilities owned by the county. And, the county commissioners on this call can correct me if I'm wrong, but most of those facilities now, nursing homes, extended care facilities are privately owned. They're not owned by the county any longer. So the language is limiting, but there is a process that involves the political parties. They would actually have a, bipartisan board of elections that would go to these places, on election day or even before election day. It's written in the context of absentee balloting when it was written. So there is a mechanism there that, the problem is the language is just so outdated. I think it still uses the term poor district and other language from the 1930s that society has moved well beyond, and so I think this is another opportunity perhaps to just update the election code, with current language that would facilitate the same policy goal, but without the limitations.
Well, and the nice thing about that provision generally is it in essence takes a polling place to the facility. It's not just, it basically takes everything that would make a polling place and puts it in the facility. So it has all of the security, all of the checks and balances with it, but as you said, it's very limited and is not used very much. So that's part of absolutely one of the things we want to look at and come back to you down the road and say, yeah, this could help. Okay, so then we're going to go and get into some more debate-like topics because we're going to swing into in-person voting and talking about voter identification. And the big issue is, when is voter ID required? When you're voting. And currently, if you're a first-time voter, you will be asked to provide identification when you go to your polling place. If you moved, you might be asked to provide identification. I think there's also I wouldn't swear to this one because I'd have to go back and look at the statute, but I think there's also like a random, the county will just say check IDs randomly for people, but it's not every voter and it's not every time. And so the question that we want to raise and we want to have you talk about, and it's probably going to take more time than some of these other topics took, is do we require voter ID every time you vote? I mean, I think that's the bottom line. Should voter identification be presented every time a person votes? Jonathan.
I think Christina actually put her hand up before me. I didn't
There
notice
she
it right
is.
away. And she might be about to ask the question I was going to ask her, clarify something.
I was just going to state with reference to there being something in the code that allows for ID checks like randomly. That's not, there's nothing there that I'm aware of. Yeah,
okay.
so that's it.
I wasn't sure.
It is only when someone is voting for the first time at a new location that their ID may be checked, and that's it. So an inactive voter is a voter that is taken off, or that is about to be taken off the rolls, that is inactive, only needs to sign an affirmation to attest to their identity. They do not need to show ID as well.
Okay, good enough. All right, so well, I guess the first question should be, do we want to make a recommendation about this? Do we want to go on the record saying yes, we support, or no, we don't support. And Pat has his hand up, but I saw you waving, Russ. So Pat and then Russ and then Lisa.
I'm actually happy to defer to Representative Diamond if you'd like to go first. I was going to speak to the prior point you actually just, or question you raised.
Oh, okay. Russ?
So this was not a work group I sat on, and some of the information in the work group's report is a bit fresh to me, although I did read it briefly before, but it's a bit for. I just wanted to point out that on the first, well, it's actually the second page of the report. I mean, 90% of Republicans, 60% of independents, and 50% of Democrats support voter ID. And then when you break it down by race, 70% of whites, 66% of Hispanics, and 50% of Black respondents, and 61% of those who did not identify of any of those, they support it as well. It looks like the majority of people actually support voter ID. I get that there are people who object to it, but it certainly looks like no matter how you break it down, at least half in any segment that was broken down there do support voter ID. So I think that's a message that we should take. It's a message from the people.
Okay, Lisa.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that those numbers of people that support voter ID are people that don't realize that in Pennsylvania, we already have a system in place for people where we know who they are. Voter ID, any of these laws to just further disenfranchise voters and create barriers. So I just want to be on the record as saying that I am not at all in favor of any voter ID change.
Okay, I thought I saw Randall and Jonathan. Yes. Randall.
Thank you. As an election director who started in 2012 when this experiment was occurring, I am a bit torn on it. Some things I'm going to throw out for that should be part of the consideration. We had numerous polls in Lancaster County prior to voter ID in 2012 who would ask their voters for the ID, and just because they couldn't, it wasn't political at that point. People didn't object. It wasn't required. And they had determined that they were able to poll workers were able to significantly faster process voters and find them in a poll book when they had the name spelled out in front of them on anything, including an ID. And so some of those precincts actually went to having people write down their name to accomplish the same thing. With e-poll books, the ability to swipe an ID and make that processing line go faster is also a very real thing. On the flip side, the way it was done in 2012, I mean, we had individuals who were legitimate registered voters who no longer had the documentation necessary in order to get a new PennDOT driver's license. And so I had many calls from people who were going to be stuck in that, who didn't have the birth certificate with the raised seal, didn't have whatever that they needed in order to obtain a new ID. And so the Department of State, in order to try to resolve that, created their own ID for voting to fill in the gap of people who didn't have what would be considered a ID for the purposes of voting, so that they could continue to vote. So I guess there's some variety of things besides the normal political aspects of this thing on a practical matter to consider. But if it's done, it needs to be done right, and it needs to be done so that folks that are legitimately who are voters and certainly don't need to jump through a whole bunch of new hoops to get the ID that we all take for granted. I mean, my whole family all has driver's licenses, and I'm sure everyone around this on this call does as well. But there are people who don't for a variety of reasons. And, the way the law was drawn up the last time really complicated things. And the Department of State tried to make a workaround for it. Ultimately, it didn't go through to be enacted fully. But those are things that need to be kept in mind for any voter ID discussion is, operational efficiencies at the polling place or inefficiencies at the polling place that it would create. And also, making sure we're not disenfranchising people who are citizens, are voters, and, have been voting for many, many years and simply, no longer have what the rest of us take for granted.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mostly agree I agree completely with Randall. I just wanted to add a few points. Having lived through it, I saw it play out in real time, and whatever is in place cannot result in a voter being disenfranchised, someone who's qualified to vote being disenfranchised. That's the threshold that you have to meet. And that's easier said than done. And we saw it as this unfolded. We saw American citizens from Puerto Rico who didn't have the documentation necessary to get an ID. It wasn't just about not having access to IDs. It was also partly about not having access to the documents you needed to go through the vetting process to get an ID. And as this thing unfolded, it became very clear that, and the court ultimately ruled this way, it was unconstitutional because it resulted in people who were qualified to vote and registered to vote in many cases being denied the right to vote because of the ID requirement. So, that's the threshold that you have to meet. So whatever is being designed when you're talking about identification, all of those things have to be kept in mind. It can't result in voters being disenfranchised, for for a lot of very good reasons. Not the least of which is, we'll go through a lot of costly litigation again and end up in the same place that we were after the last round.
Okay, I see Joe, Dan, and then Ken.
Yvonne, I'm sorry, Ketsy's hand was up before mine.
Oh, where'd she go?
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay, sorry.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I wasn't a part of the actual work group conversation, but I just wanted to say that I agree mostly with what everyone is saying. The only thing I will add is that the list of what we considered eligible IDs should also be a substantial list, right? It should not just be a driver's license, because we do have many people, at least here in Philadelphia, that don't have a driver's license, don't have access to a driver's license, or don't have access to some of those necessary documents that Jonathan was just mentioning, that are required to be able to obtain a Pennsylvania state ID. And so, keeping in mind that when we're talking about identification required, that the list is long enough that folks will be able to select from one of those options to be able to obtain an ID in order for us not to suppress the vote.
Okay. Thank you. Joe?
Am I up next? Okay, thanks.
You're up next, okay.
And I agree with that. The one thing I wanted to say also, though, I think sometimes we forget that every time an unqualified person who's not eligible to vote votes, every eligible voter who does vote is disenfranchised. So I want to keep that in the forefront as well. I think we forget and overlook that many times.
Okay. Dan.
Thank you, Yvonne. The prior speaker, Quetzy, made a very valid point about people who perhaps do not own an automobile or don't drive. We have a set of circumstances in our county, and I'm sure it's true in some of your counties, where we have a substantial Amish population, and they do register and they do vote. So your point, Quetzi, about having various options available, I think would be applicable to those folks as well. So I'm certainly sympathetic to that point of view. But secondly, I have a question for Jonathan, if he's able to answer this. Hypothetically, given the current regulation in terms of a new voter or a first-time voter in a new precinct, if they walk into the polling place and for whatever reason are unable to provide some type of qualified identification, I assume that they are, though, at that point in time, permitted to vote with a provisional ballot, and then as a follow-up can go back to the voter registration office to then verify their identification and then have their vote count. Is that true? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Commissioner Vogler. Yes, that is true. I do want to point out as well that to Ketzi's point, the list is also very broad for first-time voters. It includes not only a variety of photo identification, but also non-photo IDs, including a utility bill or something else that a voter can use as proof. So that list is quite broad to start with. But you're correct, though. If the voter, for whatever reason, is unable to provide identification, they would be entitled to vote a provisional ballot. And then the Board of Elections would ultimately make a determination as to their qualifications to vote and whether their ballot should be counted.
Okay, Ken, you're up.
I think everyone wants fair, safe, and secure elections, and I certainly do, and do not want ineligible people to vote or for people to vote twice. We do have voter ID, as Yvonne said, for the first time, and if you move and you do that, if we were going to go beyond that, as many of the other committee members have said, it needs to be broad, and we cannot disenfranchise people in the name of that.
Okay. You know what the problem is, how I miss people, is I'm on gallery view and it shuffles you around. So Amy, you just popped up next to me, so I see your hand.
Yeah, I know when we worked on this in the work group, we were pretty much under the consensus that the current list of applicable IDs that we have is a good starting point. If this is going to get, if we're going to say that somebody has to have an ID every single time they vote, it has to look like the list that we have currently. It cannot, we can't force people to use a driver's license or an ID, something like that. And I also just wanted to reiterate that in my time as an election director, we only have had one instance where we had to do an investigation on an issue in and around voter ID. So it is not a rampant issue. At least it was never in my neck of the woods. That's it.
Thank you. Pat.
Yep. Well, Yvonne, maybe I'll take it back full circle to the initial point or question you just raised, which is one of the decision points is whether or not a voter should have to show something each election they show up in person, right? Not just the first election. I mean, after that, this point was also raised. If you do have to show something, how big is that list, picture or without a picture? I would certainly argue for both. And then also thirdly, if someone does forget, like what do they do? To the points that Joe and Amy just raised, I mean, it's not like no one's. It's not like there's never been an instance of in-person voter impersonation fraud. So it's not zero, but I don't think it's a huge number either. But that's one side of it. The other side is, of course, like someone who either wouldn't have anything on the list, which would also be a very small number of people. But also the folks who may show up on election day and they forgot their ID, right? And they may have to, they could either run home or there would be a safeguard option, which actually was included in Representative Seth Grove's 1,300 and 1,800 bills for them to swear in an affidavit that they are who they say they are. So at least to me, it seems like the principles that were laid out there are the right ones. Make sure it's not doesn't tamp down turnout or turnout certainly amongst any group or class of voters. But then those are the 3 decision points. And the last thing I'll say, that I'll kick it to Joe, is that I think it's, we see this in other states. It works. It can work to show ID every election. So I'm sure I would anticipate us finding consensus around that. It'd just be figuring out what exactly should be on the list, photo and non-photo, and then what to do if someone forgets, or for that very small number of people, what they do if they don't have anything that's on that list, even if it's expansive. So Joe, to you.
Yeah, I mean, and to that point, Pat, I think that's why you absolutely have to have the provisional ballot acceptable or accessible to anyone who would forget or not have an ID. I want to go back to Lisa Dealey's point as well. I mean, she talked about the fact that we have safeguards in place currently. One of the issues that we see, however, in that moving forward is the shortage of poll workers. Polls were set up at local precincts for a reason, so that as people came in, you were familiar with the folks. You'd see them at the grocery store, you'd see them at the post office, wherever it may be. And there was at least somewhat a familiarity with those folks coming into your precinct. Those days have changed quite a bit. I think we can all agree. Even in my rural Pennsylvania, I can go to my poll and half the people that come in there have moved here from out of the area, so I don't know who they are. And that's great. That's wonderful. However, having some sort of ID is going to make it much, much faster to get that person through the line and into the system. So just another thought.
Well, then I think what I want to get from all of you with this discussion is an authorization to draft a proposal on requiring voter identification with expansive IDs, with answers to the provisional ballot. What do you do if you don't have anything? With the understanding that we're producing it so you can look at specifically at language to see if it is something you can support, not necessarily. I mean, we may come back with some language that 90% of you will say, yeah, we're good with that, let's do that. Or you might come back with some language that everybody says, not so much, let's think about it some more. Again, we're not making lifetime commitments here right now. So I think from our perspective, an authorization to try to draft something that would incorporate all of those aspects is what we're looking for. Russ's thumb is up. Okay. Everybody wave at me, thumbs up, whatever, if you're comfortable with us trying to do that. Okay, they're slowly coming. Okay, you guys were making me nervous there for a minute. Okay, so we'll try to work our legislative drafting magic and come up with something that everybody, oh Lordy, everybody's not going to live with, but it will make enough people happy that we can do something with it. Christina, did you have your hand up again? Okay, Joe.
Just real quick, Yvonne, this came up yesterday in a discussion with one of our Democratic House members, piece of legislation that's currently being floated. And that is to put a time limit on the amount of time a voter stands in line at the polls. And this really lends itself to this whole discussion as well, because unless we have some sort of automation to move people through more quickly, I don't see how that's ever going to be a guarantee.
No, I mean, you don't know. The first Obama, there were people lined out the door at my polling place. Other times, well, I live in Middletown. The council's always fighting. There are always election battles. So everybody turns out for every election. But, oh, and I just said that in public. Okay. But, there are elections where turnout is a lot lighter and you might see 50 people come and go during the course of the day. But to try to put some kind of time limit on that, I see other heads shaking no, so I'm not hallucinating here. Okay, obviously we're not going to get through this whole agenda, and I'm okay with that for reasons I'll bring up later. But let's move on to the next issue, and that is satellite offices. And we talked about satellite offices, and one of what we really two aspects of that came up. One, that as with most things that we ask the counties to do with precincts and polling places and elections, is that it should be optional on the counties, based on the county's needs. And that if you're going to have satellite offices, they should look like polling places. They should not just be walk up to a counter and not have all the precautions you would normally have at a polling place. So, so as we're talking satellite offices, we mean satellite places to vote. I probably didn't explain that all that well, but Amy, would you like to take a stab at it? And then Christina's right behind you.
I know that at the beginning of the meeting, we mentioned not going down avenues that involved unfunded mandates and resources to counties. And this is a thing that the majority of our counties are not going to be able to execute. And if they were mandated to do so, it would be a nightmare.
Okay, cool. Ken.
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, the satellite offices aren't polling locations, so I don't understand why they would have to have the same. It's not a polling location. It became a great frustration for us. It's not early voting. They are not voting there. They can come in, they can fill out their application. If they want to wait, it comes back. But you know, I just think it became very confusing. People call them early voting centers. They are not early voting centers. They are not polling locations. It's simply a satellite office for voter registration. So you would need the things that you need there. But I think we need to be careful when we call them polling locations or refer to it as early voting, because that's just not the case.
All right, well, then I may have misinterpreted my notes as well. Jonathan.
I'm actually going to defer to Christina. I think she beat me with her hand up.
Oh, okay.
Then I'll go.
I had many of the same thoughts that Ken mentioned. And I think, Yvonne, what might be confusing is in the report you had talked about, should there be some type of early voting, or should there be what there is now, which is satellite over-the-counter vote by mail?
Yes.
So,
yes.
And it is a clunky way to say it. It's a clunky thing to explain to people. But I think that regardless of how it is looked at, I think what's really important here is that it is not a polling location. And Ken is completely correct there. It's not possible to put the same provisions in place for that. But what we really need to do from a codification standpoint, in my opinion, is really just kind of put some legislation together that really just dictates what the chain of custody is with those ballots, to ensure that regardless of whether or not counties choose to use this or don't choose to use this, there are provisions in place under the law that dictate how this happens.
I know, Joe, you have thoughts on this because you shared them in some work groups. I'm going to let Jonathan go next and then let you take it.
Thank you, Yvonne. I was not in this work group either, so this may have been covered. I want to make sure I clarify. A lot of this, I agree with everyone else. I think some of this is just the term of art that's being used, and that contributes to the confusion and controversy. But I don't even like the term satellite offices, because of the connotation. But it is something that's explicitly authorized in the election code under the section of the law where it talks about expenses of counties. Counties have to pay for at least one county office for the election board, but they can provide for additional ones outside of the county seat. And voter registration is also explicitly authorized by the voter registration law. The county is empowered by the law to set up offices for voter registration throughout the county at municipal buildings. And it actually provides a list of examples. But it is a mouthful to say, in-person absentee or mail-in voting at a county, a secondary office or whatever you want to call it. So, it's hard to articulate to people, but I know there was a lot of controversy about it, a lot of confusion. So I just want to make sure the record's clear that those are things that are authorized by the statute explicitly.
Well, and that is something, and I'm not trying to cut you off, Joe, but that is something we do want to discuss down the road. And that's the whole concept of early voting and the ability of voters to register to vote, and then register for a mail-in ballot and complete the ballot and turn it in, pretty much one-stop shopping, which Jonathan will gladly tell you is authorized in the statute. But there are concerns people have raised around those, and that is something we also need to talk. Joe, Dan, and Russ.
So Yvonne, I just want to clarify, because I'm hearing two different things. When I heard Ken, and I've heard Ken mention this before, I think if I'm not mistaken, Ken, you're talking about a satellite election office where people can go to get registered, to answer questions, to help with the process of voting, but not voting as a vote center. Christina's talking about where you can go and do an early vote. Am I missing that? I misunderstood.
It's to you can request a ballot, fill out a mail-in or absentee ballot, depending on whichever one you apply for, fill it out, and then deliver it back to the county over the counter at the same establishment.
Yes. Okay. I mean, obviously we do that, every county does that currently. And that's why I was confused. I misunderstood you, Ken. I apologize for that.
No problem, Joe.
Okay, Dan.
Thank you, Yvonne. My question will most likely be posed to Jonathan, since he would have the familiarity with this. Assuming, Jonathan, that it's the Board of Elections in each county would have the responsibility or authority to determine the location of a satellite office or offices. Is there any language in the current statute or regulations that stipulate that, let's assume you had a Board of Elections that with two Republicans and one Democrat, and the two Republicans make the determination that they're gonna set up 3 satellite offices in the county, but they're only going to put them in the areas in which the voter registration is already very heavily Republican, and they're going to overlook the parts of the county where perhaps it's more Democratic, or vice versa. Is there anything to your knowledge that currently prohibits that from happening? Again, assuming that it's the Board of Elections that makes the determination of the location. Thank you.
No, thank you, Commissioner Vogel. It's a very good question, and I'm glad you brought it up. I am not. I'll verify this, and if I'm wrong, I'll clarify. But I'm not aware of any, any list of, limitations or specific requirements on where that it's left up to the discretion of each county Board of Elections. And I believe that's the case not only with the election offices, but also these voter registration, locations as well. I don't believe that there are any requirements placed on that, but I think that is something that, and maybe this was discussed by the work group. Again, I wasn't on this particular one. That may be something that should be looked at to put some guardrails there, so that there are clear rules about how these things should be utilized in a given county. It's a difficult balance. We're a very diverse Commonwealth, and we, as a Commonwealth, we have a lot of local government, and a lot of deference is given to local government to make its own decisions. What's best for its residents, whether it's a municipal government or a county government. Then you're trying to balance that with the idea of uniformity throughout a specific process. In this case, the process being the administration of elections. So, you know, you have to strike the right balance and maybe putting guardrails in place so that there's not even the appearance that a particular county is manipulating the process.
Russ?
I got a little confused as well. I had to step out, take a call quickly. And when I came back in, Ken was talking, and I believe Christina was talking. And it occurred to me that they were saying that there were no places that were actually receiving ballots back, completed ballots back. But I think that's just, maybe I was just misheard that. So, I mean, my comment would be is that if you are attending a voter who is requesting a ballot, and that voter steps aside, fills out that ballot, hands it back to you completed in the secrecy envelope or whatever fashion that is required by law to you, they are voting, and that is a polling place. And our take, at least in the House of Representatives, was if you are doing those two exchanges, you are now functioning as a polling place, and the security, the same security, poll watchers and all that sort of thing that applies to a polling place should apply there as well. Because now you have voters who are coming in. We have laws that allow electioneering on the way into a polling place. So how would those laws apply here when this is, if you don't consider this, I think they have to be considered a polling place when you're doing that exchange back and forth between a voter and an elections official.
Okay, Pat, and then Christina.
I'll just make a quick point on distinguishing between the two, which we did get confused about. I think the voting centers, which I think most of us what comes to mind is like having actual poll books, actual voting systems, actual ballots cast like on the spot is one thing, which from what I recall, I don't think anyone thought that the counties are interested or in a position to set up that sort of operation. But the over-the-counter voting by mail or by absentee, which Joe you just mentioned that counties have been doing this for years in their main offices. So the only difference more recently through Act12 is that counties could set up additional physical offices to do the same thing. I mean, I think the thing we'd have to think through is, and what's in those offices is the election staff processing paperwork as they have always done for years. And then voters, if they're filling out their mail-in application or filling out their absentee ballot, mail-in or absentee ballot, doing what they would have done in their kitchens for years and years and years when they do that. And so there's no actual ballot being cast onto a system, which is why I think it would be that is not a polling place situation to me. A full-fledged voting system, a voting center or early voting center with poll books and voting systems, I think is another matter altogether. But the over-the-counter stuff. It'd be a little strange. I think we had poll watchers hanging out in our main election offices going forward. We never did that before. I'm not sure why we have to do that going forward.
Christina?
For sake of time, Pat just touched on all of my points, so we're good.
Okay, cool. Jonathan and then Amy.
Yep, just a real quick clarification. What changed, as Commissioner Kant said, counties were doing this in practice for years. What changed is Act 77 actually mandated. If a voter shows up and applies for an absentee or mail-in ballot, the county is obligated by statute now to provide them with a ballot, give them an opportunity to vote it, and return it back to the custody of the county. So that's really what changed. It was something that was being done in practice in a lot of counties. Now it's explicitly mandated by the election code. Per Act 77.
Okay, Amy.
And in 2020, we did actually have the party send watchers to our office to monitor this early in-person voting. It was incredibly disruptive to the process because there was so much gray area around what they were allowed to do, what they're not, are they allowed to be there? And Jonathan might know more about this, but I believe that there was some litigation in and around it because I know we altered our practices and they had to stand outside of the office. at one point. So I'm not sure if there's any case law on it or not, but it was very disruptive to us in 2020.
All right. Russ and Pat, did you forget to put your hands down, or do you have something you want to talk about?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate this one point. If we were talking about, again, the voting centers that other states have with poll books, hard copy or electronic, and the actual voting system, that is a polling place situation again, where it would be appropriate to have watchers. They would have a formal role as they do at a polling place. But again, that's not the sort of system we have right now.
Okay, Joe.
Just real quick for clarification, when I say we've done this for years, of course, it's been under the auspices of the absentee balloters. That being, a dozen or a few people in a small county has now gone to hundreds of people with the mail-in Act 77 legislation. And I know that there's a lot of legislation being talked about to change how we do this so that maybe if deadlines get backed up for mail-in ballots, but then the vote over the counter gets extended to 7 days before the election, those numbers will continue to increase. So this is something that I think we have to keep an eye on, because to Russ's point, if we go down that road, we are essentially turning it into a polling place at that point. Again, minus the equipment, as Pat said, but the numbers are going to turn it into actually more than a lot of our polling places see in a day's of election day.
Lisa.
I think that the number of people that are availing themselves to the ability to vote at an election office should change, how it
Lisa, we can just about hear you. Could you speak a little louder?
Yeah, I was just, I'm agreeing with Pat's points, and I'm also mentioning that, the number of people that are availing themselves of the opportunity to go to a vote, an election, a board of elections office to request and get a ballot should not change, the process. It's still a board of election office. It is not a polling place. Whether one person uses it or 50 people use it, they're still using it for the same purpose, and it should not be seen as a polling place because it is not.
Jim.
Thanks, Yvonne. I just want to, I kind of side with Pat on this one, because I think the difference is in a polling center, voting center, polling place, traditionally, we have to cast the vote there. And so all the protections should be around that center. But where it concerns the satellite offices and people walking in and at the same moment applying for an absentee ballot or mail-in ballot, and then choosing to stay there and fill it out, they don't have to stay there and fill it out. They could take it home and in the privacy of their living room, fill it out, and then come back the next day and deposit it at the satellite office. So I think that the protections designed for polling centers or polling places and voting centers of the traditional sort aren't necessary except for the points that Amy made, where it frustrates and you end up with 50 people in a room that should only have 5. Other than that practical concern, I don't think from a legal standpoint it's a concern of mine, for what it's worth. Thanks.
Okay. I have Pat, Amy, and Christina still have their hands up. Are we speaking? Okay.
I just wanted to say, with regard to Jim's most recent point, the other issue that also differentiates between a polling location and a voter service center is the employees there. You're looking at actual county employees versus elected poll workers that only do this twice a year. And I think that's a big difference as well.
Okay, we're going to keep plugging along. The next area we looked at was election official training. I think one of the proposals that we had heard was that that although there should not be rigid uniformity in the standards for each county, there should be some guidance, some parameters identified for areas like processing nomination petitions, campaign finance disclosures, timetables, determining how many employees you need, how many paper ballots you need. And so one of the recommendations we saw was to have the Department of State prepare statewide guidance with consultation with a group of active election directors who would be able to provide real life input into that. Now, whether that would take the form of a statute, if that, I mean, we can make suggestions to executive departments and they can ignore us completely if they want to. So the question is, and there have the coming up with standards with this group. Amy is no longer, I believe, an election director, which means we no longer have an active election director on this board. So I think the consensus is that this board is not the board to be making those recommendations for the Department of State, that it needs to be active election directors. So I guess my question then is, A, do we tell Department of State they need to establish standards? And B, do we tell them they need to have an advisory group of, say, a dozen election directors, something like that? I mean, do you want us to write a statute that says, Department of State, you need to do this. These are the areas we think it should cover, and these are the people you should consult. So, and Jonathan has his hand right up there. Jonathan, you speak for the secretary.
I think, you know, first of all, it is something that we do now. I think what's being discussed here is basically a training program or some sort of certification for, you know, election officials at the county level, and we certainly support that idea. And the department issues guidance to counties now, and you mentioned, Yvonne, recommendations to the executive branch, and they can ignore you. This is, I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but the counties can do the same thing with the Department of State. We can issue guidance, and they can follow it, or they can decide not to follow it. You know, so that dynamic doesn't really change, you know, if we're putting training together. But certainly, you know, we have a SURE advisory board. We have other ad hoc groups of county election directors that we work with on a regular basis on election administration things to develop, you know, guidances, you know, changes to the you know, SURE system and other systems that we use for election administration. You know, we work hard to get county input into those things. So I don't believe, you know, in practice is going to be a whole lot different than what we're doing now. I think, you know, for us is, what exactly do you want the end product to be? There's been some discussion about a certification program for county election directors, something they would have to do, so that if a county commissioner is looking at, you know, a county election director, you know, or somebody in county government, they have some assurance that this person is either already qualified because they've gone through this training program, or that the opportunity for them to go through this training program is available.
Okay. Randall and then Amy.
I don't think this should be legislated. I believe, and I believe Joe was on the work group with me on this one. This should be a CCAP function. CCAP should create a program in order to offer some level of election director certification, but it should not be something we are having the Department of State utilize, being required to do. And I don't think it's something that the election director should be mandated by the state to do. There are very few individuals who are coming into the position of election director anywhere who are experienced in doing the job. Those of us who are experienced aren't applying for election director jobs. Right, Amy? But anyway, yeah, I think this should be a CCAP function, and I would not support mandating the state to provide this. I do believe there's a need, and I think done best, it would even break out counties by their types of election equipment vendor, because so much of what a county does to make it work is based upon the equipment they use. There's a role for the Department of State, timelines, and the guidances they provide. But I think the training certification, if it's to exist, and I don't think that's a bad idea, but should be done as a voluntary process through CCAP. And I think most counties would want their election directors to get or demonstrate that level of certification, but I'm not in favor of mandating it or having the state provide it.
Amy? Where'd she go?
Yep. So I don't know if it should be mandated or not, but there should be something more intensive in place. This job is not the job it used to be 5 years ago. There is no room for error anymore. Little mistakes are amplified in this, this climate that we live in, and election directors can't make them. So it's really important that they are clear on statute, on their responsibilities, on what they're doing. And when somebody comes in to this position and they don't have somebody in their office already with institutional knowledge that they can lean on heavily to learn these things, it can be very difficult. And unfortunately, there's no time for a learning curve in this position anymore. You cannot make a mistake. You have to get it right every time. So I don't know what that answer is, but I do think that there should be a more intensive training situation for directors.
Okay, Dan, and then Jonathan.
Thank you, Yvonne. I like what Mr. Wenger proposed, and I'd perhaps like it even more if such an undertaking were done jointly or cooperatively between CCAP and the Department of State, if they perhaps work together on the curriculum or the requirements, etc. But I do like that idea. There's a little bit of irony here, though. We're talking about training or potential certification of election directors. And in most counties, election directors report to the Board of Commissioners. Interestingly enough, and speaking as a commissioner, we're not required to have any training or any certification. All we have to do is get enough votes on election day. Very interesting. But again, just to come full circle, I like what Mr. Wenger is proposing. Thank you.
Jonathan.
No, I was going to say, I agree as well, making this function of CCAP, and I'll give you the reasons. The department should have a role. I believe it's appropriate for the department to have a role, but putting it entirely on the department, look, I've worked across multiple administrations, governors of both political parties, but I've learned that this function being in the executive branch automatically makes it somewhat political. Having it rest with CCAP, I think, would take away some of the politics of this, and I think that's a good idea, just for that reason alone.
All right, I think we can write a recommendation that's more general, that isn't a statutory mandate, that I think everybody could probably feel comfortable with, and we'll bring that back to you. Clock is ticking away, and that's okay. The big elephant in the room, I'm semi-happy not to be getting to today, because I think we could spend 3 or 4 hours on it alone, and that's the absentee and mail-in ballots provision. The absentees, I think there are some recommendations that could come out relating to absentee ballots that would be controversial and pretty much consensus based. We are in a situation right now where we don't know what's going to happen with mail-in ballots. We have had the Commonwealth Court declare them unconstitutional. It's been appealed to the Supreme Court. Commonwealth Court had said the unconstitutional decision would be effective last week, I believe. And the Supreme Court said, no, that deadline is not going to work for us, and extended the stay of the implementation of the decision. I believe they're holding oral arguments this week, next week, on the issue of whether or not mail-in ballots are constitutional. I think I said this in one of our other work groups. I cannot even begin to predict to you how this decision will come out. I could argue both sides of it aggressively and possibly effectively, but I don't know. I don't know how it's going to come out. And so then that puts us in the position of, we have a lot of good ideas of ways to improve mail-in ballots. We have had a lot of discussion on things that issues people had with mail-in ballots, and we have talked about some of the ways that they could be addressed, on which I think it's important and they should get out there soon. On the other hand, by the time our report comes out, there may be a decision from the state Supreme Court that says they're unconstitutional and they're gone. And then everybody, they get thrown out, and we have spent a lot of time trying to draft legislation that's not going to go anywhere. So I think from our perspective, what we will try to write for the report is where the problem areas were identified, where we would make recommendations to clean things up if mail-in ballots continue, and leave it at that. I don't want this group spending hours working on and debating language that may end up being moot. So I don't want to ignore them. I think we can discuss them at length in the report. But I think any actual recommendations at this point would be a little premature. So obviously it's going to be an important chapter of the report that you're all going to want to read very carefully and make sure you're all comfortable with the way we've described and set things out. But I think at this point, I think we do know some of the things we would do to improve mail-in ballots if they're going to stick around. So I think if we get a decision in favor of mail-in ballots, when we start working again in late summer, early fall with the work groups, we can hop on that and we can draft stuff and potentially even do an interim report that would say, here, here's what we got. But I think that's where we stand right now with that. After the June report comes out, I think we do want to talk and discuss where some of the work groups are going, if we want to reconfigure any, if we want to create some new ones, depending on issues we did not get to. But I think that's where we are now. So our goal coming out of this meeting is to go back, draft all the stuff we talked about up to this point, and the issues that we have not made a decision on recommendations yet, we can we can identify and we can say, here are some of the potential responses. I think that's where we are. Jonathan?
Yes, I'm sorry, Yvonne. I'm a bit of a chatterbox today, but I just wanted to say a couple of things on this issue before we close out. I know we'll revisit this. As you noted, there's litigation. We have no idea what's going to happen. But I wanted to make a point. We looked at data over the last 2 elections, and I realize it's only 2 election cycles in the midst of a global pandemic. So we don't know what this trend is going to look like over 5 years or 10 years. But one thing that did stand out to me, whether mail-in ballots go away by order of court or repeal, if that were to happen, I think one thing for the group to look at is absentee balloting. Let's say we go back to absentee balloting, who qualifies? Because what we noticed, one early trend is that people 65 and older are using this significantly more than younger voters. Especially as compared to the share of registered voters they're roughly 14-15% of registered voters. But in the general election in 2020, both the primary and the November election, they voted by mail-in ballot at a rate of, I think, like 35% of all the mail-in ballots were cast by individuals 65 and older. It was even more pronounced in the municipal election cycle last year. In the primary, it was almost 50%. In the November election, it was over 50%. So that means more than half of the voters who availed themselves of mail-in balloting in last year's November election were above the age of 65. And for that group of individuals, they don't qualify for an absentee ballot unless they are assigned to a polling place that is not accessible. So it's something to think about. I think maybe a placeholder that this group should think about. If by the time we meet again, something has changed, the status quo has changed, based on a court order or something else. I just wanted to make that point because it really stood out to me that mail-in voting is actually helping the people it was designed to help. And that's something we shouldn't forget.
Okay. Jim.
Thanks, Yvonne. Can you just help me understand procedurally going forward? We have another Zoom meeting on May 26th, I think, and at that meeting, we intend to vote on the final report. But you had talked today about maybe drafting legislation and giving us a chance to review and comment on that. Does that happen in another Zoom meeting, or do you expect that that's going to happen via email, or how does that work out?
We'll send the draft stuff out a couple weeks before the May 26th meeting, so we can get feedback from everybody. Obviously, the agenda for that meeting is going to be considerably shorter than this one. And so I expect us, so we don't want to drop it on your lap 2 days before the meeting. So we want to be able to get the drafts out. And then when we actually meet, we can have a conversation where we're amending while we're having conversations. Somebody would say, yes, I support this proposal, but I think, for an example, if we did a proposal that said, okay, Department of State must do standards, and we hadn't had this conversation, and we had provided you with legislation, and then you came in and somebody said, well, I don't think it should be state, it should be CCAP. Let's amend this and put CCAP in instead. Those are the kind of things we would be doing in that May 26th meeting, but we would get it to you in advance so you would have time to review it and look at it and see where you did have issues with it. And then what we would also do and always do normally is, even though we would have you approve the recommendations in the statutory language at the May 26th meeting, we would give you one last thing to look at it just to make sure we didn't make any mistakes. And that would be the expectation, that you would come back to us if we if you saw something that did not represent what you thought you agreed to, that we could do that. Okay, Representative Diamond, thank you. Take care. He just messaged he has to leave. So that's kind of how we would do it. Dan. Gotta unmute, Dan.
I apologize. Thank you.
I do it all the time, so I'm glad it's somebody else.
No, my apology, and I'll make a second apology. I have a quick comment, quick question. The comment is an apology to all of you. I've talked a lot more today than I had anticipated. And actually, I've broken a New Year's resolution. One of my New Year's resolutions was to talk less and listen more. And today I talked a lot, and I apologize, and I appreciate your indulgence. My question relative to the meeting in May, is it possible, given the downturn in COVID cases, is it at all possible for us to meet in person or allow both in person and Zoom? And I ask that question as one who probably has the longest drive to Harrisburg. I live close to the Ohio line, and it's about a 4.5-hour drive, but I'm willing to make it because I'd much rather sit in a room with you folks. I just think we get a lot more done in a better manner, but that's my question. Is that a possibility for May? Thank you so much.
Yeah, and Yvonne, before you answer, let me jump in and say I would like for it to be a possibility and would recommend it. We talked about that at CCAP. Several of us were at CCAP and discussed that. Personally, I don't know that hybrid works. I think we're in this world now where we're trying to do both. So my druthers would be that it's one or the other, that we make it an in-person or we make it a virtual, and I would vote for an in-person, but I would defer to people on that. But I think it is time for us to actually be in a room, and I think this would be a good meeting to do so.
Glenn, you're the boss. I mean, I
agree. Sure, we can try to make those arrangements. We'll find a meeting space, but I think barring anything unforeseen with some new virulent variant that pops up, I think we're probably, I don't see any obstacles to doing in person. We're starting to get back to that with some other groups, so I think this group will be fine.
No, and I agree. I do not like hybrid at all. I don't really like people calling in. I find it harder to pay attention to the people who are not physically in front of me. And so, yeah, I'm a kind of all or nothing kind of person. Randall.
I personally, since I no longer work in the industry, prefer the Zoom meeting. I've taken off 2 hours here today to do this, and I prefer to do that as opposed to make it 4 hours to commute up and back. But I agree the hybrid's not a great idea. I think Zoom is awfully convenient, and we can accomplish most of what we need to do that way.
My only thing about that is I can get more hours out of you when you're in person, because you're willing to commit to the whole day because you're already losing 4 hours traveling. So Zoom does force you to be more efficient. I will give it that, I think, generally. But yeah, okay, we'll go back. Glenn seems to think it's okay. I won't ask you to do it a lot, Randall. Just once in a moon.
Yvonne, it's easy for me. I'm here,
yeah.
So
yeah,
I'll do whatever.
Yeah.
Yvonne, I understand both sides of the issue, and I agree with Chairman Lawrence. A hybrid is not the solution, but so that no one feels pressured one way or another, what I might suggest is that you take a poll from the members and see what suits their schedules best, and then make that determination after that information is in your hands.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable response, and we'll put Wendy on that because she's the one who's going to have to coordinate all of it. Jonathan, We see something.
I was going to say, as Commissioner Cantz popped up in my view, I was going to say, you know, we could, I don't know if this is a possibility for the commission, but you know, there's, we could look at maybe regional meetings as well. So we're not always coming to Harrisburg if it helps other folks who may live in various portions of the state. I'll note that going to Snyder County would actually be a quicker drive than driving to Harrisburg for me.
That's right. The two of you
I'm
shop
always
at the
happy.
same.
I'm always
You two
happy
shop-
to get on the turnpike and travel to Pittsburgh or even go up, you know, across Route 80 to go to Erie if it takes that. So it's just a thought.
We're not categorically opposed to regional meetings. It's more a logistical thing for us. We do not have the world's largest budget. So if we're going to go somewhere else, we like to look for a volunteer among the group to offer, you know, a conference room or whatever, so that we're not, you know, paying to rent a space or whatever. But yeah, we'll look into it and see what we can come up with. And on that note, it's after 1. Thank you all very much for coming and spending your time and staying focused. And some of my colleagues have expressed envy that that I have this group because you talk and I don't have to pull teeth to get responses from people. So yeah, your dedication is definitely appreciated, and we'll try to get you some good stuff to look at for May, wherever we end up looking at it. So thank you very much. And I think on that note, Wendy can shut us off.
Yvonne, we just need a motion to adjourn from the chairman.
Can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting, please?
So moved, Jim Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Second.
Second. All right. Anyone opposed? All right. Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Yippee skippy. Thank you all.
Thank you.